Hamad Al Khalifa. He is currently the head of monitoring and evaluation at the Directorate of Crime Prevention in the Ministry of Interior under Public Security's Community Affairs and General Directorates. This is his second year as head since May 2019. Dr. Sheikh Mohammed was previously in the Joint Counterterrorism Center under the General Directorate of Operations and Training as a specialist and project manager, and gained much experience in the operations and training field, as he is also instructor at the Royal Police Academy, where he teaches subjects such as Introduction to Project Management, Strategic Leadership, among other topics. Previous to that, he was in the Customs Affairs as a specialist, and then was promoted to Strategic Coordinator in the Customs Strategy 2017-2020. Kindly note to our audience that we will have Arabic interpretation available through the Zoom application at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Sheikh will begin his presentation momentarily. Then we will have a discussion session where we will pose some questions for him. And finally, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. Dr. Sheikh Hamad, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. My PhD thesis title is Crisis Management and Strategic Flexibility, the Moderating Role of Electronic Readiness in the Case of the Government Authorities in the Kingdom of Bahrain. I chose Bahrain as my sample site because Bahrain is a thriving island, and it is part of the GCC, but it is quite unique compared to some of the neighboring countries, as it has huge potential. Bahrain is one of the only countries with government authorities within the kingdom that stand under the ministries, and they have more flexibility compared to traditional ministries. Nothing can compare in the GCC. Bahrain has recently faced 3 severe crises, which are the upheavals in 2011 and the crisis of oil prices, as oil represents the primary source of income for the Kingdom of Bahrain. Finally, the COVID-19 crisis pandemic that we're facing right now. Dealing with crises of this kind is usually the responsibility of the public sector in Bahrain. The government sector is part of 2 types. The first is the traditional sector, which is characterized by rigidity. And the second is governmental authorities, that the government granted preferential treatment, which is more flexible. The study population consisted of the 14 authorities within the Kingdom of Bahrain, with a total number of distributions that reached 4,874 employees, which is quite a large group of people. However, I'm very thankful that I had the help of BIPA, Bahrain Institute of Public Administration, which helped speed up the distribution process. I'd highly recommend them for questionnaire distribution, as they were a major help during my journey. So I'm going to be talking about the topics that are in front of you right now. I'm going to have an introduction, the aim of the research, and so on. So let's start with the introduction. First, I'm going to be talking about strategic flexibility, crisis management, and electronic readiness. So strategic flexibility is going to be the independent variable, which has flexibility of capacities, the flexibility of resources, the flexibility of information, and the flexibility of coordination. Next is crisis management, the dependent variable, with its variables: detection of early warning signals, preparedness and prevention, damage containment, activity recovery, and learning. And lastly, we have electronic readiness as the moderating variable. And the variables are ICT infrastructure, human resources, management requirements, and physical capabilities. The aim of the research objectives is the main contribution of this topic is to test the ability of Bahraini authorities to deal with crises and to test whether they acknowledge strategic flexibility to deal with crisis. Also to test electronic readiness as a moderating variable. The Bahraini government authorities were chosen because the research assumes they have more flexibility compared to other governmental entities. Next, I'm going to be talking about the gap, which is what is missing in the research. So this model is new to Bahrain. After revising all research about the relationship of strategic flexibility and crisis management, I could not find any research which is related to Bahrain. The second gap, usually research of crisis management is done on normal ministries and departments. My research is done on authorities. Why will this fill the gap? Because the authorities have a special position that the government gave them, and they have more flexibility compared to what we usually have in traditional ministries. There is no single model, to the best of my knowledge, that has built a model between strategic flexibility and crisis management while using electronic readiness as a moderator. In the study literature review, there are researches in strategic flexibility on crisis management, or the impact of electronic readiness to crisis management. But none of those suggested models using electronic readiness as the moderator. So this is the gap that my research is trying to cover. Authorities have a special situation. They have higher flexibility than normal ministries and governmental entities. So this research will try to test whether this type of flexibility was successful in dealing with crisis management. In an adequate manner, no one before my research studied this effect on this flexibility on crisis management. So what is crisis management? What is strategic flexibility, and what is electronic readiness? Crisis management is the process by which a business or other organizations deal with a sudden emergency situation. And it has three different stages of a crisis and different types of crises. You have biological crises, you have a natural crisis, you have a financial crisis, and just to the subject that matter right now, let's talk about crypto crises. And they have different ways to adapt, avoid, or minimize the damage. Next, we have strategic flexibility. Strategic flexibility is the ability of the organization to proactively adapt to environmental variables through the readiness to modify or change its strategy and to take advantage of opportunities to cope with difficult circumstances and accelerated variables in a timely and appropriate manner. Electronic readiness is identified as the capability of an economy of the country to prepare themselves for taking an active part in the process of operational digitalization. It is of immense significance in highlighting the value of a community in terms of its ability to evaluate the opportunities as well as challenge relating to technological change adaptability. Bahrain, for example, is one of the most electronic ready countries in the GCC. Moving on, we have the types of crises. The pre-crisis phase is concerned with prevention and preparation. This happens as the first stage of a crisis. The crisis response phase is when management must actually respond to a crisis. This is when you start dealing with a crisis. This is when you start fixing the crisis. Lastly, we have the post-crisis phase, which looks for ways to better prepare for the next crisis and fulfill commitments made during the crisis phase, including follow-up information and whatnot. Next, we have the crisis management variables, which I talked about earlier. This is the detection of early warning signals. This is the first variable of crisis management, and any problem or disruption that triggers a negative reaction to the government authority or country, it depends on the crisis at hand. It depends if it's biological or financial or an oil crisis. That could impact the organization's financial strength and ability to do what it does best. Containment of damage, usually the most vivid stage of a crisis. The goal of crisis containment and damage control is to limit the reputation, financial, safety, and other threats to firm survival. So crisis handlers work diligently during this stage to bring the crisis to an end as quickly as possible, to limit the negative publicity to the organization and move into the business recovery phase so they can get back on track. The crisis learning phase. In the middle of a crisis, organization decision makers adopt a learning orientation and to use prior experience to develop new routines and behaviors that ultimately change the way the organization operates. The best leaders recognize this and are purposeful and skillful in finding the learning opportunities to inherit in every crisis situation. Preparedness and prevention. So the prevention part is to actively happen all the time. So you have to have activities that work on a daily basis. And preparedness, making arrangements to create and testing plans, training, educating, and sharing information to prepare communities. Should an emergency eventuate, these are also actions, and they are happening all the time. Let's say, for example, where I work right now, community affairs. We have awareness programs. We have awareness programs for the elderly. We have for the young generations. We have for smokers, etc. So awareness programs are here to help you as well. Lastly, we have the recovery of activity. This goal of the recovery phase is to move an organization from a crisis to resuming normal business or operations while continuing to rebuild confidence and trust in the organization and or country. Next, we have the strategic flexibility variables. So we have resource flexibility, coordination flexibility, flexibility of capabilities, and flexibility of information. So the flexibility of capacities is when the ability of the organization is to invest the skills and technology available to it and restructure its various capabilities and employ them to improve and to develop services to cope with the rapid changes and environmental uncertainties. We have resource flexibility is the ability of the organization to deal with all the financial and human resources, knowledge, and skills which give it the ability to activate its strategic options through different administrative systems. or the capability to accumulate flexible resources with multiple uses. Coordination flexibility is the capabilities to create a new resource combinations through an internal coordination process. The flexibility of information is the extent to which the organization has a database to provide information on events encountered in the past and to store data and information about what is happening in the present and the possibility of data after analysis so you can use it in the future. Future proofing is one of the main aspects of the flexibility of information. The electronic readiness variables are ICT infrastructure. Technology is effectively used to technological innovation in an organization and has two components, hardware and software. Hardware is part of the technology that includes physical components, while the software is part of the information-related aspects that are used to perform specific tasks. And if the organization wants to adopt e-learning, it must have many requirements, such as hardware and software necessary to use those devices so that it owns physical devices, such as servers and networks. It is also the information and communication technology infrastructure and systems, which include firmware, networks, and the government authority websites that are or have been used in the government authorities. Human resources is the division of the business that is charged with finding, screening, recruiting, and training job applicants, as well as administrating employee benefit programs that will further enhance the welfare of the government authority. There are 4 areas of assessing HR readiness: organizational culture, management and leadership, operational readiness, and technical readiness. Management requirements are the requirements that vary from organization to organization. But most organizations share the following: documenting the process used to manage the requirements, interacting with the team and reviewing them, project management, which is one of the most important parts of that, developing plans and strategies that clarify the objective to achieve in the project management process when you have a set goal of plans. Next, we have training. It is necessary to provide members of the organization with the information, knowledge, capabilities, and skills that lead to increased productivity. Lastly, we have physical capabilities. Physical capabilities is an important part. It's an indicator that measures and analyzes enabling factors in the development of financial and physical systems in several economies around the world that identify priorities of that by improving sustainability in institutions, providing these resources for training, which is one of the essential elements of electronic readiness. This is the model that I created. So as you can see on the left side, we have strategic flexibility as the independent variable and its dimensions: flexibility of capabilities, information, resources, coordination, and the dependent variable, which is crisis management and its variables. And on the bottom, we have the moderating variable, electronic readiness, and its variables as well. So as you can see, having them intersect each other when the independent variable and the dependent variable have a direct relationship with each other. although the moderating variable comes in the middle and mixes the batch. So having that as a bundle is quite hard. So I actually had a challenge while doing this model as well, which I'll be talking about later on. So the research methodology I chose was the quantitative analysis approach. So using the quantitative analysis approach throughout survey instrument to reach a wide range of employees working in different authorities which deal with different fields. This methodology is widely utilized in business and management researches to answer research questions related to how many, how much, where, what, and who questions. In contrast to other strategies, it allows researchers to collect large amounts of data from sizable sample sizes. Accordingly, it fits into the current study that attempts to collect large amounts of data from research participants. I've also used structural equation modeling, but why did I use it? And what is structural equation modeling? Structural equation modeling is a multivariate structural analysis technique that is used to analyze structural relationships. This technique is the combination of factor analysis and multiple regression analysis, and it is used to analyze the structural relationship between measured variables and latent constructs. Because my model is a complicated model, and what I mean by that is my model includes a moderator. The second reason is to use sequential equation modeling because of latent variables. And what are latent variables? Latent variables are when you're measuring the variables using so many statements in questionnaires. So SEM, structural equation modeling, is the best tool to analyze models that will use questionnaires to measure the variables of the model. So what are the main achievements of the research I made? The main achievement throughout testing strategic flexibility as the independent variable on crisis management, as I showed in the model previously, and testing the electronic readiness intersection effect on the relationship between strategic flexibility and crisis management, as I explained in the model as well, and selecting the Bahraini government authority as the study population, which according to the spread out fact, authorities in Bahrain have more flexibility than traditional ministries. This is the gap that needed to be filled. Concluding, the study found that there is a significant impact of strategic flexibility on crisis management. The intersection effect of the electronic readiness as a bundle found that it is insignificant. However, when I checked the intersections of the dimensions of electronic readiness, I found out that both physical capabilities and human resources from the electronic readiness variables have a significant intersection effect on the relationship between strategic flexibility and crisis management. A significant impact also found for each dimension of the strategic flexibility on crisis management. The main idea of my research is that I would like to convince those leaders in the Bahraini government authorities that it is not just the resources that will lead to better management of any crisis. The resources should be there, and it should also be flexible. In a more precise way, the authorities should be capable to efficiently identify notable changes taking place in its external environment, followed by its rapid adaptation. Authorities should be ready to identify as well as allocate resources to the new step of the action plan that came into existence with the changed processes. The effectiveness of strategic organizational flexibility is also governed by its relative ability to recognize the changes taking place in the environment, to identify the most suitable ones in accordance with the changes in the scope of their field they're performing in, and finally react towards it. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the future endeavors that I'd like to tackle. So I'd like to write a research about the Kingdom of Bahrain and how crisis management was managed throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, how they tackled every obstacle, and how they will face something similar in the future. I'd also like to have crisis management, strategic management, and e-management taught in universities, among other subjects I'd like to see in universities in the Kingdom of Bahrain as well. So we can be the benchmark of education once again. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheikh Hamid, for that insightful presentation of your PhD thesis, as well as with the crisis management flexibility that you've gone through with us today. Before we open the questions from our audience, I just had a few questions that I wanted to pose myself to you.
Yes.
So you talked a lot about your methodology and how identified the different gaps within Bahrain and within crisis management. But in essence, what motivated your research?
Well, the motivation I got from starting my crisis management journey was actually my father. He motivated me in doing something in crisis management. So I took the liberty of checking what was missing. And thankfully, I found a few subjects I was looking into. I started with crisis management and social media. So that field was a bit too big for me because I had to go through different types of analysis types. And then it evolved into crisis management in Bahrain. And then it evolved finally to crisis management, and then I added strategic flexibility, and lastly I added a moderator. The moderator came at the end of the mix.
That is very good, sir. We know that producing an academic survey takes a lot of work, takes a lot of back and forth between you and your supervisors on this project, but just to get an idea of the scope, how many questions did you have in your survey that you came up with?
I had around 50 questions in my survey that reached around 5,000 employees, 4,874 employees to be exact. But I only got 378 replies. My aim was 370 employees, but thankfully I went over 100% by a small margin. Although I had two false questionnaires. One of them had one throughout the survey, and the other one had 5 throughout the survey. So those were insignificant. So I had to get rid of those. So the total number of surveys that are correct are 376.
Yes, obviously you have to throw a wider net and to catch the fish. So that's exactly what you did. We had over 5,000 targets, but caught a little bit under 400 for that. But the fact that you were able to provide this data is really significant, both for the development of Bahrain in terms of its own crisis management processes, and hopefully it will add and instigate crisis management education and different forms of awareness for this very important topic for our country.
I actually had the help of BIPA as well.
Yeah.
They were very helpful with distributing the questionnaires throughout the authorities because they had direct relationships with them. So that helped me a lot.
especially since they're also involved in the educating the public sector of Bahrain. So they're the best partners you can get for this kind of endeavor. But I just want to ask, how was the overall cooperation with the survey? I know you said not everyone answered it, but can you give us more details about that, sir?
Yes, of course. Well, to be honest, some authorities, I got a direct reply within a few days, and some actually took a few weeks. So we started out with 20 surveys, then it increased, it kept increasing, although it reached to a point where it stopped at 200. So that was very frightening for me, although it got momentum. And then it went to 378, which made me very happy. Although going through every question and going through every survey and going through editing everything and looking at the numbers, that took a lot of time. That took around a few months for me.
Absolutely. And I'm sure your supervisors also had a very direct role in helping you shape the survey as well. Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, you mentioned before about the different stages of crises, pre-crisis, during crisis, and post-crisis. So out of all of your research that you've conducted, which, for you, in your opinion, is the best one to be in?
Well, the best crisis situation to be in? Okay, let's say it this way. So post-crisis happens after the crisis, where you finish a crisis and you learn from what you did. So let's say, for example, we're done with COVID. COVID is gone. COVID is extinct. So what do we learn from here? We learned that biological viruses and whatnot are dangerous. So in the future, we're going to be much more careful with hazardous viruses, biological wars, and whatnot. Although we have to be ready for another one. So we have to be ready for the next stage, which is going to be pre-crisis. So when you're in post-crisis, you're waiting for pre-crisis. And when you're in pre-crisis, you just finished a crisis. So you're on to the next one. So you're in a mixed bag over here. It depends on where do you want to be? Do you want to be before a crisis or after a crisis? Because it's going to be a really hard place to be in. And I'd personally like to be in a post-crisis situation where I get a breather time.
Absolutely, because when you're in the midst of a crisis, you're just trying to remedy the situation as fast as possible. And the post-crisis, like you said, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, it gives you a little bit of a breather, but at the same time, it gives you the lessons learned of how to manage the crisis. I think that will conclude our discussion section. So now we will open the floor to some questions. And Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, we received some questions. Some broad questions about crisis management in Bahrain, and we're hopefully that you could perhaps have some input on this topic. We have our first question. What is some of the key success factors for crisis management in Bahrain based on your experience and your studies?
So let's say, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic that we're facing right now. Managing this crisis has been very hard, very difficult. Although His Royal Highness Prince Salman bin Hamad has been at work. I'd probably guess he hasn't been sleeping well because he has been working non-stop. He has been taking us to the next level. We also opened a World Health Organization office in Bahrain yesterday. So we are managing this crisis very well, and it's going very smooth to date.
Yeah, I think also if I can add, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, I think this goes to show that that crisis management, it's flexible, like you suggested before, that it's always ongoing. And I think the main lessons to be learned here that we need to develop our own strategic supplies of key medical equipment, and necessary medical procurements within Bahrain itself, in case if a future crisis, God forbid, arrives in that is a virus like COVID-19. But I think also at the same time, this goes to show the testament of His Royal Highness Crown Prince Sheikh Salman about his team and how they've handled this crisis. Obviously, we've just passed the Delta variant a couple months ago, so now the situation is a lot more stabilized than before. And I think this will be a benchmark and how Bahrain is becoming a role model in terms of crisis management when it comes to COVID-19. And like you said, we have the WHO opened its first regional office in Bahrain. This is a testament to how we have been dealing with this crisis. And hopefully we set an example for not only the region, but also for the rest of the world. Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, we also have another question about how does Bahrain manage to provide public services during the crisis? We know we did a vaccination campaign and we reached very high levels, but do you have any other examples of how Bahrain managed to provide public services during the time of crisis?
Yes, I'm currently working in the police station in Bahrain. So over there we have 4 floors. We have a floor for the traffic and police, and we have a floor for the passports, and we have a floor for community police, and also for crime investigations as well. So we didn't close. We never closed. We were open the whole time. We were accepting people to come in, and but they have to be vaccinated, of course, because we have to take priority in COVID-19. Although we faced a bit of a challenge with allocating people. Let's say, for example, we usually have a few hundred people a day. So that was limited to, I think, 30 people each hour. We're managing, and we also have services online for the Ministry of Interior. So we're actually doing a good job with being electronically ready as well.
Maybe perhaps the initial rush for the demand of electronic services for the ministry was a bit much at the beginning, but I think now it's definitely stabilized, and the proper infrastructure has been developed in order to cater to these services that require. Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, I have a question for myself actually. You mentioned before that we need to create awareness within our education about crisis management.
Yes.
I know it's a very broad topic, but do you think this will require cooperation from the Ministry of Interior along with the educational sector in Bahrain, or do you have any other stakeholders that could provide useful lessons to develop this very important topic in Bahrain's education system?
Yes, of course. Although we don't have a ministry or an actual place that manages crises. So that needs to be built, that needs to be made. So that would be one of the main aims that Bahrain has to go to. We have an emergency room, a crisis room in the Ministry of Interior, but it is not working at 100% right now. Although managing a crisis in Bahrain depends on which ministry you're in and what type of crisis you're facing, whether it's biological or a natural disaster, let's say, for example, the heat wave or whatnot. But that's a different type of crisis.
Absolutely, I think you nailed the head of the nail when you said that crises, they can involve a lot of different sectors, a lot of different areas within a country. So this goes to show that any form of crisis management will require a lot of cooperation from different sectors within the government and non-government organizations as well. In regards to crisis management in Bahrain, what is the role of innovation? I think you hinted on it before, you're saying forming different organizations and ministries that would be responsible for crisis management. But do you see any other sort of innovations in particular for E-Readiness when dealing with a crisis?
Well, let's say, for example, electronic readiness. Electronic readiness is one of the most important things we're having today. Let's say, for example, the shopping industry, going to the supermarket. It's been transferred to the phone. You don't need to go to a supermarket anymore. What else?
Even the payment system,
Even the payment system, yes.
Rise in usage since COVID came.
I think you can renew your passport as well online now. You can do virtually everything is possible online. Bahrain is the most electronically ready country in the GCC.
Yes,
I actually have some friends from Jordan, from Kuwait that keep telling me that when we live in Bahrain, everything is easy, everything is simple because we're so electronically ready.
absolutely, and I think we also developed the proper infrastructure for the increased demand for electronic services, like you said, and I'm sure also having Amazon Web Services in Bahrain also is a huge advantage for not only the country but for the region, for the cloud security, for the infrastructure, for the ease of transfer of information. It's a major asset that I'm not sure. I don't have a lot of expertise in this particular field, but I'm sure it played a big role in managing e-readiness during this time of crisis.
Yes, AWS is actually it is the best to use. And we in Bahrain are the hub. Most of Bahraini websites are based in, let's say, Arizona or in different countries, but now it's based in Bahrain. Any website is based in Bahrain. AWS is a Bahraini hub right now. So that is a major goal as well.
Absolutely. So you can say this cloud infrastructure within Bahrain, the servers here, it's a major innovation that showed its worth and its value within this time of crisis. So we can only imagine what it will be like when we're not going through a crisis, when things have de-escalated and everything is a lot more normal. We also have one more question for you, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed. Did crisis management in any way affect public service innovation within Bahrain? I know we talked about how the Ministry of Interior, they felt they had some initial challenges with people being vaccinated when they're going physically to the different areas. But now we saw that there are electronic services that could also do the same services that people require to do on a daily basis. Do you see any other different innovations when it comes to public services from your experience and your research, sir?
Yes, I can see, let's say, for example, public transportation now. It's going to be a bit hard to use public transportation during the crisis pandemic that we're facing right now. Although that will be much easier in the future. And
I think also when we develop the metro system, inshallah, that also creates more avenues for public transportation and for Bahrain as well. And I'm sure these systems will all be automated and they will be very fast and efficient in very effective ways. If anyone has any additional questions, be sure to send them to us now. But I just wanted to say, I thought your research was very insightful. The fact that you identified very specific gaps within Bahrain and its crisis management in terms of e-readiness is a very important topic. And I hope that there's a lot, not only just awareness created for this very important topic, but it's also enacted on a very deep level, both in terms of education at a primary level, secondary, and a higher level as well. Sir, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, do you have any final remarks or input that you would like to say before we close today's session, sir?
Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming and everyone for staying to listen to our Think Talk today. And I'd like to thank you, Mahmoud, for being a great host as well.
Thank you very much. And we do apologize for some technical difficulty as well. So we also faced a little bit of crisis management before, but we resolved it. So now we're in the post-crisis stage. So thank you again, Dr. Sheikh Mohammed, for your time, for your insightful presentation. And be sure to follow Dirasat Bahrain on Twitter, on Instagram, on all our different social media accounts. And we look forward to hosting you, Dr. Sheikh Hamid, and the audience to future events. Thank you.